And I wanted to stay at home. I was tired of staying away. And so I stayed with my mother, lived with my mother, and went to the University of Miami. And I continued there for 4 years and graduated in 1939. Still the Depression was on. And I was fortunate to find a job because people didn't have jobs. People had forgotten how bad it was. There was no Social Security, and there was no income, and people nowadays just don't realize how hard up things were. Widows were living around Stanton and elsewhere they'd lost a lot of things in the Depression, and they opened up their houses as rooming houses and that sort of thing. But I went to the University of Miami. I worked at all sorts of things while I was at the University of Miami to keep rolling along, and finally graduated in 1939.
And what job did you get?
I was fortunate to find a job. There weren't any jobs. The war had not started. We were still in the depths of a depression. And fortunately, one of my friends, I went to a fraternity brother that I went to school with at the University of Miami. His father was knowledgeable around town with different people. And he put in a good word for me with the CIT Corporation, which was a finance company like Commercial Credit, and GMAC. And their offices were at One Park Avenue, main offices, One Park Avenue, New York. And CIT not only was involved in financing automobiles, FHA contracts, appliances, they also were connected up with insurance company, and they had all sort of interconnecting. So I went to New York on a train. I've never forgotten, rode on the train in the dining car. I met the representative from South Florida to the U.S. Congress and sat and talked to him. And when I was in New York, I got interviewed, and then they sent me to Nashville, Tennessee to work in the branch office there of CIT Corporation. So I went to work for them as what they called an adjuster. I had a man on a desk who looked after two men. I was one, and he looked after another man. And he assigned us our jobs, and we went out and did what adjusters did at that time. You not only collected bad accounts, but you helped repossess automobiles. You went calling on people that had FHA loans and could not repay them. And eventually the CIT Corporation would apply back to the government and get paid back on the loan. It was a guaranteed loan for them, but they had to do a lot of work first. We'd go out and call on these poor colored people way out in the countryside who had lived in a little wooden house, and some salesman had gone out there and sold them brick siding that looked like brick siding, asphalt, and tack it around the house and around the windows. And they didn't have the money to pay for it. And you'd call on those people several times until it was finally determined at the office that they were uncollectible, and went through all that. It was something. We would also call on automobile dealers. I was assigned to the Nashville office, went all over Middle Tennessee. And these automobile dealers would sell automobiles and not pay off. They were financed by CIT Corporation. And they would sell the automobile, but CIT wouldn't know the automobile was sold. So we would go out to a warehouse where these automobiles had been stored for months because they couldn't sell them. They'd have Hudsons, a whole rows of Hudsons. And you could see where you'd climbed over that same car a month before to check and see it was there. You saw the dust prints, and you checked the license, the engine number. And you had to lift up the hood to do that because they didn't put engine numbers where you could find them very easily in those days. But it was interesting work. And I stayed with that work I roomed in a rooming house. These are things I remember more than AMA. I had a rooming house where my pay was $95 a month. For the rooming house, I paid $35 a month, and that gave me supper and breakfast if I was there when the service field time. Of course, I had my own room, but I shared the bathroom with about 4 or 5 other people. And that's the way we lived, because that's all you had. Now, of course, the best part of it was I was given a brand new Studebaker Champion. Just turned over to me. Gas was no problem. Gas was so cheap, they didn't even keep track of the gas. I just automatically went to filling stations and filled it up and signed and walked out. So I could drive anywhere I wanted to on my own business or the company's business, and using that Studebaker Champion. It was so light I put 2 sandbags in the rear of the trunk to hold it down. But that little car took me everywhere, and I'd call on dealers all over Middle Tennessee. It was quite an experience.
Yeah, it was a high cotton job.
Well, of course, I was sent to Birmingham, and I lost the car because I was then on a desk. And but I'm sure I got paid more, but I don't remember what it was. But when I went in the Army and when Pearl Harbor came along and I got that red bordered telegram, I got $125 a month, which is a whole lot more than what I'd been getting. And a ration allowance too.
Man, you got
different times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got that red bordered telegram.
The Army kept, when we left AMA, most of us that had ROTC for 4 years went to an ROTC camp. And I and my roommate were sent to Fort Washington, Maryland, where we joined the 3rd-year students from military colleges. So we were there with them for 6 weeks. And when we left the camp and were approved, we were given a certificate that entitled us to become 2nd lieutenants of infantry when we reached 21, because we were all about 18. Now the college students, when they left and did their 4th year of ROTC at a college, they were already would be 21 by then ordinarily, you see. They'd be about 22 years of age. So that's how I got my commission in the Army. When Pearl Harbor came along, I was down at the office that Sunday because we had to send in a report to the Home Office on a certain day each month. And this time it was on Monday that I had to get the report in. Of course, Pearl Harbor occurred on Sunday, and I was down there getting my report ready when I had the radio on and heard about it. And it wasn't long after that before I got a red bordered telegram telling me to report to Fort McClellan, Alabama. So I did.
Now, if you went to your training, where did they ship you?
Well, there were a number of us that were assigned to Fort McClellan, Alabama, a number of officers, just newly called on to active duty. And after we were there for a few weeks, we started getting orders, and I was sent along with others, in this instance, to Camp Blanding, Florida, and was assigned to the 36th Infantry Division, which had just come there from Louisiana. It was a Texas National Guard division. It was the only National Guard division that was all within the borders of one state. Artillery, the whole works, were all within the borders of Texas. It's so big. Now, Virginia, for example, only had the 116th Infantry here as part of their national 29th.
Now, from Florida, where did you go?
Well, from Florida, we went to North Carolina. This was in the spring of early spring of 1942. We went to North Carolina from there and had maneuvers between North and South Carolina. Then from there we went to, by train, went to New England to Cape Cod, at Camp Kilmer, Cape Cod.
And then how long?
And we were in Camp Kilmer until this spring of 1943, when we went to, we did all sorts of an amphibious training off of Cape Cod in the waters there. We went to New York and boarded ships for North Africa. And by convoy went to North Africa. My whole battalion was on one ship.
Wow. How was the trip over?
The trip over was pretty rough. I say that because the men, of course I was a lieutenant, but the men were down below decks and they were sleeping in bunks at 6 tiers high, unbelievable. Just barely get in between the bunks. Saltwater showers. And they were fed twice a day, not 3 times a day, because one chow line would finish when the next one would start. It took that long to feed them. We had one officer in the battalion, he was a major, he was second in command of the battalion. He got in his bunk, he never left his bunk. He got seasick as soon as he got on board the ship. They had to carry him off the ship when we got to North Africa. Unbelievable. And they had the usual seasickness problems with men.
Any sub scares or anything on the way over?
I don't recall any, no. Whole huge flotilla, yes. Yes. Well, the officers were assigned, we had to take turns being downstairs below decks with the men, and you had to wear a helmet liner when you went down because you were standing by the staircase, and when they were running up, getting ready to throw up, they'd come down on top of you, so the helmet liner came in handy.
Tell me about North Africa, arriving there, what was it like?
When we arrived, the ship that we went over on had terrible motion in the sea. I'll add on this what happened. It was called, the name of it was a Hawaiian shipper, but we called it a Hawaiian dipper because it would go down in a ways and come up. It wasn't intended for ocean travel, just island travel. But we pulled up to the dock there and unloaded. And by that time, we had problems with arms that early in the war. The officers were supposed to have carbines, but there weren't any carbines. So we had been issued in the States, we all carried .03 rifles, where the men had M1, and we carried .03 like you would carbine, except a lot heavier, of course. But we carried, we'd carry the Springfield instead of the, and just before we left the States, we were issued Tommy guns. Terrible weapon, 45, heavy ammunition, and the gun was, I never thought much of that Tommy gun. And we had to carry those, and I've never forgotten when we were tied up to the dock before we got off the ship. I leaned over the rail, and my doggone Tommy gun slipped off my shoulder, went down and hit the dock, and flew way up because of the spring it has in the stock, broke the stock. The supply sergeant was outraged. I've never forgotten. I told him it served him right for issuing it to me. But anyway, when we landed, they immediately took us out and set us up on a high plateau. North Africa is a terrible place, except right by the coast where they have some rain and where they grow crops. But it's very arid, as anyone would know, being so close to the desert. And we set up the first night on top of a hill. And there was no sound at all, absolutely quiet. And there was a big pile in the middle of the company area. Just looked rock, sounded like a big pile. Well, we didn't have time to set up a latrine before we landed, and the men would get up all night and go over and relieve themselves on that pile. And the next morning we discovered it was an Arab's house who was outraged. But Arabs are terrible. We had a lot of contact. They are terrible, nasty people. I mean, there isn't anything lower than an Arab as far as I'm concerned. And we had a lot of trouble with Arabs. Our main trouble with Arabs was that the French treated them like slaves. There were a lot of rich French farmers living along the Mediterranean, raising all these crops which they shipped to France across the Mediterranean. Had ready sale for them, had no problems at all. But when we arrived, the Germans were dealing with them just like they did with dealt with the Germans just like they did with the French. And the Germans were helping them transact their business and sending everything back to France, and I guess some of it got to Germany. But the French farmers hated the American troops because we interrupted their commerce. Now, of course, the people in the cities, and we were close to Rabat most of the time, liked the soldiers because they spent their money freely and bought their wine and Cheerios and so forth. But the farmers hated us. In fact, one farmer sicked his Arabs on 3 of our men in my company, and they cut one of the men very much, cut him up terribly. He's still alive, and when they put him in the hospital, and when he recovered somewhat, they sent him back to Italy after we had landed. But he couldn't keep up because of the injury to his arm. So he never went into combat with us. But I talk with him all the time. He lives in Texas. But oddly enough, just a few years ago, he sent me the report. At the time, I was commanding the company because the company commander was away somewhere. And he sent me the report of the investigating officer who investigated the incident because he got so badly injured. And that investigative officer, a major, went around and talked to the neighbors, and finally he got to a French woman who told him the truth about exactly what happened. Of course, the farmer was claiming those men were over there stealing his watermelons, which they weren't at all.